There are moments in life when the world seems to pause, not from wonder or awe, but from the silent impact of something deeply wrong. It was 7:12 a.m. at the LAX International Terminal. The morning rush was in full swing. The sounds were familiar, wheels of carry-ons rolling briskly over tile, occasional overhead announcements, and the low hum of sleepy conversations. Everything about it felt routine, predictable, safe. But that illusion was about to be broken. A figure stepped slowly into the first-class boarding area of Gate 19. She wasn't flashy, no entourage, no designer logos, just a calm presence that seemed to exist quietly amidst the chaos. She wore a navy blue trench coat, slightly faded at the collar, and a soft burgundy scarf gently tucked beneath her chin. Her silver gray hair was pulled into a loose chignon, and in her left hand she held a simple wooden cane, worn from years of use but sturdy, reliable. Every step she took was measured, unhurried, and filled with quiet dignity. Her name was Dr. Elise Langford. To most around her, she looked like someone's grandmother. Harmless, unimportant, perhaps a touch out of place in a first-class line surrounded by polished business travelers and frequent flyers in tailored suits. That assumption, however, would prove to be their first mistake. "Excuse me," came a sharp voice, slicing through the polite murmurs of the crowd like glass cracking under pressure. "This is the first-class lane. I believe economy boarding is over there." The voice belonged to Rebecca Miles, the flight's chief attendant. She was in her late 30s, tall, angular, and carried herself with the air of someone who followed rules selectively. Her uniform was impeccable, her badge perfectly aligned, and yet there was a tightness in her jaw, a sharpness in her gaze, especially when it landed on passengers she didn't deem first-class material. Elise turned slightly, meeting Rebecca's eyes. She did not smile. She simply nodded and held up her boarding pass. "I am aware," Elise replied, voice calm, composed. "I'm in seat 2A. Rebecca barely glanced at the ticket. "Are you sure, ma'am? That seat is assigned to premium travelers. It's possible there's been a mistake." Elise offered the pass again, steady as ever. "No mistake." The people behind Elise shifted uncomfortably. A young businessman with earbuds halfway in stole a glance at the boarding pass, then looked away. An older couple exchanged looks, unsure whether to intervene or just stay silent. But Rebecca was undeterred. "There's been some confusion," she said more loudly, addressing the line as much as Elise. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." Elise didn't move. Her eyes didn't flinch. Not in defiance, but in something deeper, a kind of grace that didn't require raising one's voice. "I think you should scan the pass," Elise said softly. "It will clarify everything." Rebecca snatched the boarding pass from Elise's hand and glanced at the code, barely hiding her annoyance. She didn't even bother running it through the scanner. With a scoff, she turned to signal security. And then, without warning, she struck the cane. Whether intentional or careless, her arm knocked it clean from Elise's hand, and the cane hit the tile floor with a loud, echoing clack. The sound seemed to reverberate through the terminal like thunder cracking across a calm sky. Silence followed. It was the kind of silence that sucked the air out of the room. Elise stood motionless, now slightly off balance. Her right hand trembled ever so slightly, not from fear but from restraint. She looked down at the cane, then slowly reached for it. Every eye in the room was now on her. Some gasped. A few mouths dropped open. Ethan Granger, a young entrepreneur on his way to a tech conference, instinctively stepped forward but stopped himself, unsure whether to intervene or not. Rebecca's expression hardened, but it wasn't strength. It was fear masked as pride. She was no longer in control of the narrative, and she could feel it. Elise picked up the cane and stood tall, taller than she had appeared moments ago. Not physically, but in spirit. Then in a voice quiet enough to be personal, but strong enough to echo through memory, she said, "You've just made the greatest mistake of your professional life." Rebecca blinked, confusion flickering for a split second in her eyes. "Excuse me?" Elise didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. She turned and walked slowly toward the boarding counter, where a junior attendant named Naomi Wells had just returned from the jet bridge. Naomi, having witnessed the last few seconds, hurried to meet Elise halfway. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Naomi asked, concerned. Elise handed over her boarding pass. Naomi scanned it. The reader beeped. Her screen flashed. Then Naomi froze. Her eyes widened and her mouth went dry. It read, Dr. Elise Langford, founder and executive chair, Astrolux Airlines, full access, priority clearance. She looked up at Elise. Ma'am, I, I didn't realize. Elise smiled faintly. Few ever do. Behind them, Rebecca's face went pale. Color drained from her cheeks like a curtain being pulled on a stage too soon. She had unknowingly humiliated the woman who built the very company she worked for. Passengers began murmuring. A couple even pulled out their phones. The atmosphere had shifted. No longer just awkward, it was electric. Naomi, trying to recover, stepped aside. Right this way, Dr. Langford. Elise walked toward the jet bridge, cane clicking gently with each step. Not out of weakness, but as a reminder that every step taken with dignity is louder than any raised voice. As she disappeared into the plane, Ethan Granger turned to Rebecca and asked, Did you even look at her ticket? Rebecca couldn't answer, because the truth had landed, and unlike most flights, it wasn't going anywhere. The hush that had fallen over Gate 19 didn't dissolve quickly. Even after Dr. Elise Langford stepped through the jet bridge and onto the aircraft, the remaining passengers in the first-class line stood still, like a crowd frozen by an unexpected change in gravity. The young businessman with earbuds now had one pulled out, brow furrowed in disbelief. A woman behind him whispered to her husband, Did she say she's the founder? Rebecca Miles remained planted behind the podium, blinking at nothing. Her fingers hovered above the tablet used to verify passenger lists, but she wasn't touching it. She didn't dare. Not after that. Naomi Wells, the junior attendant, had retreated to a quiet corner, desperately trying to keep her hands from shaking. She hadn't known. How could she? Dr. Langford's name wasn't plastered on brochures or giant corporate boards. She was known only to those who mattered in aviation. To the architects, not the passengers. But now Naomi understood the weight of her presence and the scale of her superior's mistake. Inside the cabin, Elise settled into seat 2A with quiet precision. The first-class area was modest by luxury airline standards. Only 8 seats, each cocooned in a leather shell, lined with rosewood armrests and soft gray upholstery. Her favorite. Designed that way, in fact, years ago when she had insisted that comfort and dignity, not ostentation, define her airline. She placed her cane to the side, folded her coat neatly, and drew out a worn leather notebook from her handbag. It was the same one she'd used when she first began drafting the values of Astrolux Airlines. Inclusion, humility, service with integrity. She had believed that air travel was more than transportation. It was a symbol, a skyward extension of how we treat each other on the ground. But right now she was weighing something else entirely. What happens when those values are forgotten? She opened the notebook and drew a single line down the middle of the page. On one side she wrote, Witnessed behavior. On the other, Response plan. As she began to write, the hum of the boarding resumed behind her. The cabin crew was guiding passengers in with practiced cheer, though their smiles were thinner than usual. The story of what had just occurred was spreading quickly, moving like spilled ink through every level of the plane. And soon enough, Rebecca entered. Her posture was rigid, her movements clipped, but not confident, controlled in the way someone might walk across a thin sheet of ice, praying it wouldn't crack further. She paused near 2A, eyes flickering toward Elise, who hadn't looked up from her notebook. Dr. Langford, she began. Elise didn't respond. Rebecca hesitated, glancing at the other passengers. I'd like to offer my... Elise looked up. The air shifted again. There was nothing cruel in her gaze. No gloating, no anger. But there was clarity. Clarity, the kind that made excuses shrivel before they reached the air. Ms. Miles, Elise said, her voice calm, there are 2 kinds of apologies in this world, those given from reflection and those given from panic. Rebecca swallowed hard. I didn't recognize you. That's precisely the problem. The words weren't sharp, yet they struck with surgical precision. Rebecca opened her mouth, closed it again, and finally stepped back. She didn't say another word, just pivoted and moved down the aisle to the galley, her composure unraveling with each step. A few rows behind, a man in a tailored gray suit, a quiet observer until now, leaned toward his wife and murmured, "I think the airline's in for a serious reckoning." And he was right, because what had started as an embarrassing moment was quickly evolving into something larger. Unknown to Rebecca, someone had already posted a short clip from the gate on social media. Not of the entire scene, but just enough. The cane hits the floor. Rebecca's dismissive tone. Elise's final line before walking away. Within minutes, it had gained traction under the hashtag, a respect before rank. By the time the flight began taxiing toward the runway, it was trending. Back in her seat, Elise placed her notebook down and looked out the window. Her reflection stared back at her, lined face, calm eyes, lips pressed in quiet thought. This wasn't about punishment. It was about repair. She had worked too hard, for too many years, to see her legacy reduced to hollow corporate pledges and PR slogans. This incident wasn't unique. She knew that. It was symptomatic of something deeper, something festering in the layers beneath company policy, the erosion of empathy under the weight of routine, and she intended to confront it, thoroughly, publicly. Not with rage, but with resolve. Across the aisle, a teenage girl sat wide-eyed, phone half raised, debating whether to speak. She had seen the whole thing at the gate. Her name was Layla Monroe, a high school junior from Oakland on her way to a youth summit in Boston. She'd never flown first class before. Her mother had saved all year to make this trip special, and now, without planning it, she was watching a masterclass in poise. She leaned over slightly. "Dr. Langford?" Elise turned gently. "I just wanted to say what you did back there." Layla trailed off. "That meant a lot." Elise smiled, soft but genuine. "Thank you, dear. Sometimes all it takes is standing still when the world expects you to shrink." Layla nodded, feeling those words settle in her chest like warm coals. She would carry them for years, and so would others. In the cockpit, the pilot had been informed of the situation, and though he remained professionally detached, he made a mental note to report the incident to HQ once they landed. But someone higher than him was already paying attention, because while the plane cruised eastward across the continent, a notification landed on the desk of Marina Costas, the new CEO of Astrolux Airlines. She was Elise Langford's handpicked successor, a brilliant strategist, but also critically a believer in people over profits. Marina read the flag report, then watched the video. Her jaw tightened. She didn't pick up the phone. She picked up her tablet and opened the internal policy review dashboard. Then she typed, "Initiate review, incident at Gate 19, Dr. Langford. Priority, immediate notify. Ethics Board, HR, Comms Director, Flight Crew Committee. Objective, organizational accountability and cultural reset." Because this wasn't just a mishap, it was a moment. And in the world Dr. Langford helped build, moments mattered. At 37,000 feet, most passengers surrendered to the hum of the engines, the steady glide of flight. But for a few aboard Astrolux Flight 417, the air was far from tranquil. In seat 2A, Dr. Elise Langford closed her notebook and placed it gently on her lap. Outside her window, the clouds parted like silk ribbons. The view was beautiful, serene. But her mind churned like a storm beneath the still surface. She had not planned to intervene. She was not fond of spectacles. And yet fate, or perhaps something larger, had scripted this encounter, and Elise knew better than to ignore moments when principle collided with visibility. The gate incident had lifted a curtain on a deeper fracture, one she feared had been quietly growing within the airlines she helped build. 2 rows behind her, Layla Monroe couldn't stop watching Elise. Not in a gawking way, but with quiet reverence, the way a young pianist might study a virtuoso. Her fingers hovered above her phone. She had already texted her mom, "Mom, I just met someone incredible. I'll tell you everything when I land." Meanwhile, in the galley, Rebecca Miles leaned against the stainless steel counter, her shoulders tense, her jaw clenched. Every second felt heavier than the last. Her conversation with Naomi had replayed in her head on a loop, but worse still was the echo of Dr. Langford's voice. That's precisely the problem. She had meant it as a statement about recognition, yes, but deeper still, it was about attitude, about dismissal, about how easily Rebecca had assumed superiority based on appearance, on age, on nothing that should have mattered. And now the whispers were starting. Among the crew, even Naomi had grown quiet. guarded. Word of who Elise was had traveled swiftly, even at altitude. Someone had pulled up a press article. Dr. Elise Langford, from orphan to aviation icon, a lifetime of redefining the skies. Rebecca closed her eyes. The sting wasn't just from the embarrassment. It was from something older, something she had buried beneath professionalism, the need to always appear in control. Years ago, she'd learned that women in uniforms must always be composed, assertive, never too warm, never too vulnerable, especially women like her, who'd climbed into leadership without connections, without privilege. But in the process, she'd built a shield too thick, and now that shield had turned into blindness. The seatbelt light pinged softly overhead. Rebecca straightened and returned to the front of the cabin, just as the in-flight supervisor approached with an iPad in hand. "Rebecca," the woman said quietly, "there's something you need to see." The tablet showed a familiar video, blurry, low-res, clearly filmed on a phone, but unmistakable. The incident at the gate, her tone, her face, her exact words, playing on a loop. Below it, the headline, "Elderly woman humiliated at gate. Turns out she owns the airline." The video had been shared over 50,000 times in under an hour. Comments flooded in, some shocked, some furious, a few even mocking. And then came the message from Marina Costas, the CEO herself, not just to Rebecca, but to the entire flight team. "Team, I've been made aware of a serious breach in our values that occurred today during the boarding of Flight 417. This is no longer a local personnel issue. This is now a company-wide reflection point. We do not measure people by titles, clothing, or age. We measure them by how we treat them. An immediate review will follow landing. Until then, act with honor." Marina. Rebecca felt the words like ice under her collar. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no reprimand, no accusation. But the message was surgical. Every word had weight. Every word rang true. And Elise Langford, sitting just steps away, had said nothing more, because she didn't need to. Back in 2A, Elise watched as a crew member, clearly shaken, offered her a cup of chamomile tea. The young woman's hands trembled slightly as she handed it over. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she whispered, voice cracking. Elise looked up. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Janine." "Janine," Elise said, pausing. "You have nothing to apologize for, but you do have something to protect." Janine blinked. "What do you mean?" "Your integrity, your empathy. This world will ask you to numb those things, to trade them in for efficiency or silence. Don't. They're your compass." Janine stood straighter. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." As Janine walked away, another flight attendant, the most junior of the crew, stood behind the curtain at the galley listening. Her name was Leah, and she was only a few weeks into her job. She hadn't understood the full scale of what had happened until now, but as she watched Dr. Langford, her heart filled with resolve. She would carry this moment into every future flight, every customer she met. The cabin grew quieter as dinner service began. Light clinks of cutlery, murmurs of conversation, the occasional cough. In the stillness, Layla finally built up enough courage to speak again. "Dr. Langford?" Elise turned again, warm and steady. "Can I ask you something?" Layla said. "Of course. Why didn't you, I don't know, yell at her?" Elise smiled gently. "Because yelling teaches fear. I'm more interested in teaching memory." Layla considered that. "And you think she'll remember?" "She already does," Elise said. "But what matters is what she does with that memory." Just then, the in-flight announcement crackled on. "This is your captain speaking. We've just been informed of increased traffic heading into Boston, so we'll be circling for approximately 20 minutes before descent. Thank you for your patience." Elise closed her eyes and leaned back into her seat. 20 more minutes. 20 minutes before the wheels touched down and the world online and corporate alike began to respond. But even at 37,000 feet, the reckoning had already begun. The aircraft's wheels touched the tarmac at Boston Logan with a gentle jolt. But for some aboard Astra Lux Flight 417, it felt more like an emotional earthquake. As the cabin buzzed with the routine post-landing announcements and the familiar chorus of seatbelts clicking open, there was a noticeable shift in energy, not just from the touchdown, but from something far heavier hanging in the air. Dr. Elise Langford remained still. She didn't rush to collect her things. She sat with quiet poise, her gaze on the horizon beyond the window. For her, the descent hadn't just been into Boston. It had been into something long overdue. A confrontation not with a person, but with a culture. A reminder that change, no matter how structural or symbolic, could not survive without constant tending. In the aisle, Rebecca Miles stood frozen, gripping the intercom handle. Her fingers trembled subtly, but her voice was composed as she delivered the closing words. "Thank you for flying, Astrolux. We wish you a safe and pleasant day." Then she stepped back, exhaled shakily, and unpinned her name badge. Behind her, the junior crew huddled near the galley, stealing anxious glances at her. No one said anything out loud. They didn't have to. The silence between them was laced with shared discomfort and the unspoken realization that the video had traveled faster than the plane itself. It was no longer just about Rebecca. It was about all of them. Every employee. Every moment they looked away. Every time they had chosen rules over humanity. As passengers began to file out of the aircraft, a few offered polite smiles. Others looked down awkwardly. Some avoided eye contact with the crew entirely, their own discomfort radiating through their quickened steps. When Layla Monroe reached the front of the cabin, she paused. She turned to Dr. Langford and softly said, "Thank you for speaking up." Without shouting, Elise nodded once. "Thank you for seeing, even when others didn't." Then, to the surprise of many, Layla turned to Rebecca and held her gaze. "I hope you learn from this," she said, not with malice, but with clarity, "because I think you're capable of more." It wasn't a scolding. It wasn't even anger. It was a challenge, and it struck deeper than Rebecca expected. By the time Elise made her way up the aisle, the cabin had mostly emptied. Rebecca stood stiffly, trying to meet her eyes but failing. The weight of what had transpired was too raw, too fresh. Her usual armor of protocol and procedure had shattered. "Elise," she began, but Elise gently raised a hand. "This isn't about me," she said. "It never was. This is about the space between perception and truth, and how easily it becomes a canyon." Rebecca's throat tightened. "I didn't mean to disrespect you, judge too quickly, and I've embarrassed myself. And the airline." Elise looked at her steadily. "We all make mistakes, but the real embarrassment is when we protect them instead of learning from them." A pause, a breath. Then Elise continued, quietly but firmly. "The question now is, what will you do next?" Outside the terminal, a black sedan awaited Dr. Langford. A young assistant with a tablet and a tight expression greeted her with a respectful nod. "Dr. Langford, there's already media gathering at corporate. Marina Costas has requested a private meeting within the hour." Elise offered a small smile. "Of course. Let's not keep her waiting." As she stepped into the car, she glanced back at the glass doors of the terminal. For a moment, she saw her reflection. Older now, wiser, but the same fire still burned behind her eyes. This wasn't just about vindication. This was a reckoning long in the making. Back at Astrolux's corporate headquarters, Marina Costas stood facing a wall of screens in the executive situation room. Some showed news reports, others social media feeds. And in the center, paused at frame number 024, was the video of Rebecca Miles pointing toward the economy section and demanding Dr. Langford not hold up the line. Marina didn't speak at first. She watched, listened to the silence in the room. Then she turned to her inner circle: legal, PR, HR, operations. "We failed," she said flatly, "but we will not retreat, not this time." One executive spoke up. "We could issue a formal apology and place the crew on administrative leave." Marina raised a hand. "This isn't about optics," she said. "It's about culture. We've built a brand on inclusion, but what lives beneath the logo is what matters most." She looked directly at the head of human resources. "I want full behavioral retraining launched immediately. We'll bring in outside equity consultants. And I want all leadership, myself included, to undergo review. This is not about punishing a few. It's about fixing the entire foundation." Another executive, the VP of PR, hesitated. "And Dr. Langford?" "She's earned far more than an apology," Marina replied. We're going to offer her something no press release can match. Meanwhile, in a small break room at Boston Logan, Rebecca sat alone. Her badge was still in her hand. It felt heavier than it had an hour ago. Heavier than when she first pinned it on as a newly promoted lead 5 years earlier. A young custodian passed by and, recognizing her from the video, paused. There was no hatred in his eyes, only quiet disappointment. "You treated her like she was less," he said gently, "but she was more than all of us combined." Then he walked away, and Rebecca cried, for the first time in years, not from guilt, but from the sudden, sharp understanding that leadership, true leadership, wasn't about control, it was about humility, and she had forgotten that. Later that evening, as the city lights shimmered outside her suite, Elise received a call. It wasn't from PR. It wasn't legal. It was from Marina Costas herself. "Elise," Marina said after a long pause, "I've spent the last 12 hours watching what happened, not just with corporate eyes, with human eyes." Elise said nothing. "I'd like to formally ask you to lead our new internal equity board, not as a figurehead, not for show. I want you to shape us from the inside out." Elise let the silence breathe before replying. "I'll consider it," she said, "but only if it's not just a title." Marina's voice cracked, just slightly. "It won't be." As the call ended, Elise stepped to the window, her reflection soft in the glass. She hadn't asked for this moment, but she would rise to it. Because sometimes the most powerful revolution begins with the smallest refusal. The refusal to be unseen. The morning after the incident, the Astrolux headquarters pulsed with tension. The usually sterile halls were alive with quiet footsteps, hushed conversations, and darting glances. Everyone had seen the video. Everyone knew who the woman in the pearl blue blazer was, and everyone was bracing for what would come next. At the heart of it all, Rebecca Miles sat across from three people she had never thought she'd see under these circumstances. Marina Costas, CEO of Astrolux, Damon Reeves, the new head of diversity, ethics, and culture, and Maria Tanaka, a senior member of HR who rarely wasted words. The silence in the conference room was profound. Rebecca had entered thinking she'd been summoned for a formal reprimand, or perhaps termination. Her resignation letter was already printed and folded neatly inside her purse. But what awaited her was something else entirely. Marina was the first to speak. "Rebecca," she began, her voice calm but firm, "before we begin, I want you to know, this isn't just about discipline." Rebecca nodded cautiously. "I understand. I've made a mistake. A severe one." "No," said Damon, leaning forward. "You didn't just make a mistake. You reflected a pattern, one that we've allowed to fester quietly for years. You were the match, but the dry forest was already there." Rebecca's eyes stung. "Then you should let me go. I wouldn't blame you." But Marina shook her head. "We're not going to fire you." Rebecca blinked. "You're not?" "We're going to strip you of your current title, yes," Maria clarified. "Effective immediately, you'll step down from lead attendant responsibilities. You'll return to base-level crew status and complete a mandatory 3-month equity reformation program." Rebecca swallowed hard. That alone would have been humiliating. But then came the twist. "And after that," Marina continued, "you will serve a 6-month rotation as an assistant to the Office of Ethics. You'll report to Dr. Langford directly, if she accepts." Rebecca's breath caught. "Elise Langford," she whispered. "Yes," Marina replied. "If you truly want to learn, you'll learn from the person who showed you what leadership with integrity looks like." For a long time, Rebecca said nothing. Her mind spun. This wasn't punishment. This was a lifeline. But it required something she'd never been trained for. Vulnerability. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why give me this chance?" Marina stood slowly, placing a folder on the table. Inside it, Rebecca glimpsed dozens of printed emails, letters, and even screenshots. "Because," Marina said, "the world is watching. But more importantly, so are our employees. And they deserve to see what real accountability looks like, not just apologies." Damon added, "Accountability isn't humiliation. It's a transformation. That's the Astrolux we want now." Meanwhile, across the city, Dr. Elise Langford stood on the top floor of a modest but modern office suite. Sunlight poured in through tall windows, illuminating a clean white wall where a new brass plaque gleamed. Astra Lux Center for Equity, Inclusion, and Human Dignity Director, Dr. Elise Langford. It was surreal. Not long ago, she had been humiliated on an airplane, her identity reduced to assumptions and bias. Now she stood at the helm of something larger, something that might outlive her. A department not just built to react to racism, but to prevent it, to reshape a culture that had for too long put efficiency above empathy. Her assistant, Jordan, knocked lightly on the door. "Dr. Langford, Ms. Costas is on the line." Elise took the call, Marina's voice coming through crisp and clear. "Elise, I wanted to confirm, you've received the personnel transfer request for Rebecca Miles?" "I have," Elise replied. A pause. "I won't sugarcoat this. If you're uncomfortable taking her, we'll assign her elsewhere." Elise didn't answer right away. She looked out the window again, then said quietly, "She's not the only one who needs this transformation. The crew, the culture, this whole airline needs to see it's possible to grow." "You're sure?" "No," Elise said with a small smile, "but I'm willing." The first meeting between Rebecca and Elise was tense. They sat across from each other in a sleek but simple conference room within the new center. Elise wore her signature navy blue and soft white, a combination that conveyed elegance and calm authority. Rebecca had chosen a muted gray uniform, her hair neatly pulled back, no makeup, no accessories, nothing to hide behind. "You're here not as my subordinate," Elise began, "but as a student. Do you understand that?" Rebecca nodded. "Good, because the first lesson is this: don't speak, listen." And for the next hour, that's what she did. Elise shared stories, not about herself, but about the unseen. Passengers who had endured indignity silently, employees of color who had never felt safe speaking up, gate agents who made life harder for some customers out of bias disguised as policy. When Elise finally paused, she looked directly at Rebecca. "You were never the problem alone. You were a symptom of a deeper flaw, but you get to choose now. Do you stay a symptom, or do you become part of the cure?" Rebecca was quiet, then softly, "I want to be better." Elise didn't smile. She only nodded. "Then we begin tomorrow, not with books, with people." Day after day, Rebecca shadowed Elise. She attended listening sessions with underrepresented staff. She watched Elise mediate tense situations with grace. She sat through interviews where survivors of discrimination, some of whom had left the company years earlier, recounted moments they had buried to move on. Rebecca's eyes were open not just to injustice, but to complexity. She realized that bias didn't always look like shouting or slurs. Sometimes it was silence, or a raised eyebrow, or assuming someone didn't belong. It was the 100 invisible cuts that bled people dry, and slowly it began to change her. She no longer felt the need to defend her past actions. She no longer tried to explain away what she'd done. She listened. She absorbed. She took notes not for compliance, but for understanding. One day, after a particularly emotional session with a young gay employee who had been mocked for his voice by an older flight supervisor, Rebecca asked Elise, "How did you learn to hold space like that? Without judgment?" Elise looked at her thoughtfully. "Because once, someone held space for me when I didn't deserve it, and it changed everything." That night, Rebecca returned home to her small apartment and sat down with her laptop. For the first time, she opened the video again, the one that had gone viral. She didn't cry this time. She watched with clarity, almost clinically. She studied her own body language, the snap in her voice, the assumption in her posture. The moment she reached out to grab the armrest as if to physically control another human being. Then she opened a blank document, and she began to write. Not a press statement, not a memo, but a letter to the staff she once led, to the passengers she had failed, and to herself. The day the letter was released, it was quietly published on the internal employee portal. Not as a press release, not as a forced apology with PR fingerprints, but as an open, personal message titled simply, "From Rebecca." There were no bold fonts, no signature banners, no airbrushed portrait beside her name. Just plain text and a raw, unfiltered tone that startled many who read it. To the crew I once led, to the passengers I once judged, to the silent witnesses who had no words in the moment, but who now carry the memory, I see you. Rebecca's words unfolded, not as a defense, but as an unvarnished reflection. She acknowledged not only the flight that made headlines, but the countless micro-decisions, unchecked comments, and unconscious biases she had once brushed aside as just protocol. I now understand that power doesn't always come with malice. It can simply be the absence of awareness. But ignorance is not innocence, and silence is not neutrality. Employees from all levels read the letter during their breaks, some alone at terminals, others huddled around screens in crew lounges. The reactions were varied, some skeptical, some quietly moved. But one common thread ran through the discussions that followed. It felt real. Meanwhile, Dr. Elise Langford was presenting a sweeping initiative before the Astrolux Executive Board, a three-tier equity restoration program designed to root out not just overt discrimination, but the systemic rot that enabled it. The initiative had three pillars: cultural resensitization, including mandatory empathy simulations, historical context training, and role reversal modules for all crew members, from gate agents to executives. Passenger experience auditing, where anonymous passengers trained in behavioral psychology would document crew behavior across routes without prior notice, offering unfiltered feedback. Restorative opportunity tracks, a groundbreaking system allowing employees who had committed policy violations rooted in bias, but who showed accountability and growth, to be reintegrated through structured learning and mentorship, rather than automatic dismissal. Elise concluded her proposal with calm clarity. We do not punish bias in people, we educate it. We do not exile those who fail, we challenge them to rise. A long pause followed. Then Marina Costas leaned forward and said the words that would change company history. Unanimous. We approve. For Rebecca, the transition from former lead to ethics mentee was humbling in ways she could never have predicted. One afternoon, she was asked to sit in on a special workshop Elise was holding, not for crew, but for a new group of Astrolux recruits. Most were fresh out of training, their eyes bright, their uniforms crisp. Elise introduced Rebecca calmly. This is Ms. Rebecca Miles. She's here today not as an instructor, but as a mirror. Some of the trainees stiffened when they heard her name. One or two whispered to each other. Rebecca caught a glimpse of a headline on someone's tablet. The stewardess who got it wrong. She didn't flinch. She stepped forward. My name is Rebecca. Some of you know what I did. Some of you think you know. I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness. She paused, deep breath. I'm here because once I thought my job was to control cabins, not protect dignity. I thought the rules were clear. Follow policy, ensure safety, keep order. But I never once asked myself, whose comfort is this rule designed to protect, and whose discomfort is it ignoring? A silence settled over the room, a thoughtful silence. She went on. I used to walk through rows of passengers and assume who would need help and who would cause trouble, based on their looks, their clothes, their posture, not on facts, on instincts that were never examined. And that's how I failed. No one interrupted. Dr. Langford didn't yell at me. She didn't drag me to court. She didn't call for my firing. She let me stand in front of a mirror, and that was more painful than anything else could have been. She looked up. I don't want your applause, but if one of you walks away from this job thinking twice before you judge someone too quickly, then maybe what I went through wasn't wasted. There were no cheers, no claps, just quiet. And that, Elise would later say, was the sound of a truth finally landing. Weeks passed. Elise and Rebecca continued working side by side. While the world moved on from the viral story, inside Astrolux, transformation was becoming embedded into daily operations. Small things began to shift. Announcements from the crew became more inclusive. Check-in processes were revised to accommodate passengers who didn't speak English or had visible anxiety. Feedback kiosks were placed near departure gates, not for show, but tied directly to monthly briefings with Elise's team. Even uniforms were updated after a round of focus groups revealed how certain designs made some passengers feel subconsciously excluded. It wasn't performative. It was precise, but not everyone was on board. In one contentious boardroom meeting, a regional director pushed back. "We've had no major incidents in the last quarter," he argued. "Why spend more time and money on this? Isn't the crisis over?" Elise's voice was soft but sharp. "Do you repair the roof only when it rains, Mr. Donahue? Or do you fix the cracks before the next storm?" He said nothing more. One evening, Elise received an unexpected call. It was from Ruth Connors, the elderly woman who had been dismissed and mocked by Rebecca on that infamous flight. The woman who, unbeknownst to most, had helped co-fund Astrolux's ethical reforms after her quiet wealth and stake in the company came to light. "I read the letter," Ruth said gently, "and I've watched her, Rebecca." Elise sat straighter. "And she's not the same woman. That's clear." There was a pause and then, "I want her to fly with me on my next trip to Geneva, business class, as my steward, by request." Elise blinked. "Are you sure? I believe in consequences, but I also believe in circles completing themselves. Let her serve me, not to reverse what happened, but to remind us both. Grace, when earned, is the most powerful lesson of all." On the day of the flight to Geneva, Rebecca stood at the entrance of the aircraft, heart pounding. Ruth Connors approached slowly, her movements elegant, her presence commanding as ever. They locked eyes. Rebecca straightened. "Ms. Connors, welcome aboard." Ruth smiled, not cold, not warm, just steady. "I see you've learned to greet passengers by name now." "Yes, ma'am," Rebecca replied, voice steady. As Ruth passed her, she turned slightly. "Let's see if your service is as graceful as your apology." And for the next 8 hours, Rebecca served with quiet dignity. No performance, no nerves, just attention, presence, and humility. As they landed, Ruth leaned toward her and said simply, "You've come far. Now keep going." That night, Rebecca returned to her apartment and opened her journal. She wrote only one line. "Redemption isn't a destination, it's a discipline." When the Wall Street Journal published its cover story, "From Shame to Standard, the Airline Changing the Rules of Accountability," the phones at Astrolux rang non-stop for 48 hours. It wasn't just passengers calling. It was airline executives, media outlets, university ethics departments, even Congress. The article praised the company's bold and unprecedented response to the viral incident, describing the three-tier restorative initiative as a model for organizational justice in the 21st century. It included quotes from Elise Langford, excerpts from Rebecca's now famous letter, and, for the first time, an interview with Ruth Connors herself. "I wasn't interested in revenge," Ruth had told the reporter. "I was interested in responsibility, and in the rarest of all currencies in business, humility." The story lit a fire across the corporate world. Suddenly, Elise was being invited to speak at forums and summits, university panels, diversity symposiums, even government advisory boards. But attention is a double-edged sword. Inside Astrolux headquarters, not everyone was comfortable with the growing spotlight. Some executives feared overexposure. Others feared scrutiny. After all, the airline had skeletons, like any major institution. During one tense leadership meeting, CFO Jackson Maris raised his voice across the table. "Look, I support ethics. I support equity. But we're still a company. We sell seats. We operate aircraft. Are we turning into a social experiment instead of a business?" Elise, calm as always, replied without blinking. "We're not choosing between profit and principle. We're designing a business where those two things reinforce each other." Jackson scoffed. "That's idealism, not logistics." But Marina Costas, the COO, cut in. "And yet bookings have gone up 17% in the past 2 quarters, without a single fare discount. Customer satisfaction is the highest in our history. People trust us more now. That's not a trend. That's brand integrity." The room quieted. Still, Elise knew the real challenge wasn't in boardrooms. It was in the cabins, the gates, the 4 a.m. crew reports, the ground staff who'd been doing this job for years and were now being asked to examine assumptions they didn't even know they had. That's why she insisted on continuing the Mirror Room program, a once-a-month session where flight teams voluntarily met with facilitators to share experiences, grievances, blind spots, and victories. On a rainy Thursday morning, a quiet miracle unfolded in one of those rooms. A crew chief named Lorenzo Ortiz, an 18-year veteran, stood up holding a printout in his hand. I used to think this was all fluff, he admitted. All this sensitivity stuff. I'm a rules guy. You do your job, you get respect. He looked down, then back up. But last month I had a kid in coach. Black kid, nervous. Kept looking out the window, fidgeting. I almost flagged him. He paused. But then I heard Rebecca's voice in my head, something she said in her letter. Don't let a story your mind invented turn into someone's real humiliation. So I stopped myself. I sat with him. Turned out he was afraid of flying for the first time. Lorenzo's voice softened. I didn't flag him. I calmed him. And he said, "You're the first person today who didn't treat me like a problem." Silence. Tears quietly welled in one crew member's eyes. That day no one clapped. No one needed to. The air itself seemed to hold the weight of that choice. But while the internal growth of Astrolux deepened, an unexpected storm was brewing. A former employee, dismissed 2 years prior for unrelated misconduct, had resurfaced. Her name, Mallory Dean, a former HR manager with a public relations grudge. She had taken to social media, claiming Astrolux's ethics programs were performative smokescreens, and that she had documentation showing inconsistencies in how the company disciplined employees of different ranks. Her posts gained traction. She even scored an interview on a popular podcast. "Let's be real," she said in the interview. "They let a known violator back into service because it made for good optics. Rebecca Miles wasn't transformed. She was rebranded." The internet erupted. Hashtags like "Dust Your Astrolux," "Ain't Woke," and "Nasha Shame Flight" trended. Reporters began asking sharper questions. TV anchors dissected whether corporate compassion was real or a marketing strategy. Some critics even argued that Ruth Connor's involvement skewed the narrative. "Billionaire forgiveness isn't justice," one article read. For the first time in months, Elise felt the temperature drop inside the walls of Astrolux. In response, Elise did something radical. She invited 3 of the company's most vocal critics, an investigative journalist, a community organizer, and a former union negotiator, to come spend 5 days embedded with her ethics team. Full access, nothing off limits. "You're not here to flatter us," she told them. "You're here to test our claims. Report the truth. All of it." Rebecca volunteered to meet with them as part of the process. She didn't flinch when the organizer asked, "Do you think you deserved a second chance?" Rebecca responded, "No, I don't think anyone deserves one by default, but I think anyone who earns it shouldn't be denied one." Day 5. The journalist named Andrea Lynn asked to speak with Elise privately. She had seen the training sessions, the mirror rooms, and the anonymous audits. She had read dozens of employee letters that had never been published. She had spoken to passengers who'd been positively affected by the changes. "Dr. Langford," Andrea said, "I came here expecting a PR campaign with a moral veneer. I was wrong." Elise just nodded. "I'm not here to win your praise," she said, "just your accuracy." Andrea smiled. "You'll get both." The resulting article, "The Anatomy of a Real Apology, Inside Astrolux's Transformation," went viral in a different way. It told of a company not trying to be perfect, but committed to being better every day. It told of workers like Lorenzo, passengers like that nervous boy, and stewards like Rebecca, who once fell and chose to rise with their eyes open. Suddenly the narrative shifted again. Not because of spin, but because of candor. On a rooftop cafe overlooking the city, Elise and Rebecca shared tea in the golden light of dusk. "I never thought I'd live to see my name mean something good again," Rebecca said quietly. Elise smiled. "You didn't just live through it, you earned it." Rebecca looked out at the skyline. "You know, every time I see a new crew boarding a plane, I still get this mix of dread and hope. Like maybe they'll stumble, or maybe they'll soar." Elise sipped her tea. "We all stumble," she said. "What matters is who helps us back up, and what we do after we've stood." It started with a delayed flight. Nothing unusual. Flight 227 to Dallas had a minor technical issue. A hydraulic sensor needed replacement, a standard maintenance delay. But the way it was handled, that cracked something deeper. A gate agent named Carson, young, recently hired, still in his probationary period, was overwhelmed. The terminal was full, announcements were behind, and passengers were frustrated. Among them was an elderly black couple, Harold and Estelle Monroe, who were on their way to their 50th anniversary celebration. They had first-class tickets. But when the plane was swapped for a smaller model with fewer premium seats, chaos followed. Carson made a rushed call. He bumped the Monroes to economy without explanation, just a printed slip and a mechanical apology. Then he upgraded two younger white passengers who were frequent flyers, citing loyalty priority. A nearby passenger recorded the interaction. Estelle's eyes filled with disbelief. Harold, usually reserved, asked calmly, "Son, did you even look at our boarding passes?" Carson didn't answer. The video ended with Estelle quietly saying, "50 years, and we still don't matter." The clip hit social media like a thunderclap. The backlash was swift. "So much for reform," one comment read. "Astrolux still flying on autopilot, straight into bias." Worse still, the Monroes were alumni donors to a prominent civil rights foundation. Their granddaughter, a political strategist with 500,000 followers. Within 12 hours, the Flying While Black trended across platforms again. But this time, Astrolux was no longer the underdog trying to fix itself. Now it was the corporation that promised better and broke it. In Elise's office, the mood was leaden. "We can't afford to stumble right now," Marina murmured, watching the footage. "Not with the eyes we've drawn." Elise, arms folded, replayed the clip silently. 3 times. "It's not about the stumble," she finally said. "It's about the reflex after we fall." Within the hour, she reached out to the Monroe family directly. No PR team, no legal filter. "Mrs. Monroe," Elise said on the call, "you don't know me personally, but I watched what happened to you. And I want to say, not as a CEO, but as a woman who's worked her whole life to build dignity into every process, we failed you." There was silence. Then Estelle spoke. "It's not the mistake that broke us, Dr. Langford. It's the feeling that nobody saw us as real people. After all your programs, still invisible." "I don't want to ask for your forgiveness yet," Elise said. "Only the chance to face you, listen to you, and make things right, with more than just vouchers and PR." After a pause, Estelle replied, "Come to Atlanta. We'll talk face to face." The meeting was closed door. No cameras, no press. Just Elise, Marina, and the Monroe family are inside a modest conference room at a hotel near Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Harold spoke with quiet authority. "We've traveled for decades. We remember the days when we were told to wait, even when we had the same tickets, when dignity had a color line." He looked Elise in the eye. "You talked a lot about accountability. So here we are. What does it look like when the mistake isn't historic, but today, right now?" Elise didn't flinch. "It looks like real consequences," she said. "Invisible corrections. Not behind closed doors." She offered them a seat on Astrolux's Civil Oversight Board, a panel she had created months earlier but kept internal, made up of ethics experts and retired legal advisors. "I'm offering you a permanent role on the board so that the decisions we make aren't just filtered through corporate voices." Estelle narrowed her gaze. "Are you offering us influence or just symbolism?" "Influence," Elise said without pause, "and the authority to review not just this incident, but how we decide who matters in pressure moments." The Monroes accepted. Their appointment made headlines the next morning. Passengers become policy architects after airline fails them. This wasn't damage control anymore. It was structural integration. Meanwhile, Carson, the gate agent, was suspended. But instead of termination, Elise made a controversial call. She redirected him into Astrolux's Reverse Lens Fellowship, a 90-day program originally designed for mid-career professionals to experience the customer journey from the bottom up. Now, for the first time, it would be applied to frontline staff. Carson's first assignment? Assist passengers with special needs during red-eye shifts. Listen, carry, observe. At first, he resisted. Then, reluctantly, he began writing reflections. Weekly, candid, unfiltered. Week 3. Tonight, I helped an elderly woman get to gate 61. Her knees hurt. I asked if I could carry her bag. She smiled and said, "You remind me of my grandson, but I hope you listen better than he does." It hit me harder than I expected. Maybe listening is more than waiting for your turn to speak. Maybe it's what stops history from repeating itself. By week 8, Carson requested to speak with the Monroes in person. They agreed. He arrived with nothing rehearsed, no corporate cue cards. Mr. Monroe, Mrs. Monroe, I want to say this plainly. I didn't see you, not because I'm a bad person, but because I never had to look deeper before. You shouldn't have had to teach me that. But you did, and I'm sorry. Estelle smiled for the first time. Young man, she said, an apology isn't a destination, but it's a door, and you just opened it. Back at Astrolux HQ, the internal team was transforming too. In a surprise move, Rebecca, once the disgraced stewardess at the center of Astrolux's past scandal, was promoted to head of a new division, real-time ethics deployment. Her mission? Build response protocols for in-flight and gate-level incidents, so no future Carson, no future passenger, would face what the Monroes did again. In her first memo, she wrote, "Systems change not only when people care, but when care is operationalized. We must move from intention to intervention." Elise read it, smiled, then approved the department's budget, triple the original proposal. That same week, Elise received a letter, handwritten, cream-colored envelope. It was from Estelle. Dear Elise, you sat with us when you didn't have to. You didn't defend the mistake. You confronted it. That's not weakness. That's legacy work. We accept the board role, not just to watch, but to help build the world we waited too long to see. In gratitude, Estelle and Harold Monroe. Elise placed the letter beside her desk, not framed, just present, visible. Outside her window, a new plane was being prepped for takeoff. Its tail bore the Astrolux insignia, recently redesigned. Subtly added underneath the logo were 3 small stars, each symbolizing the values now guiding the company. Dignity, clarity, courage. As the engines roared and the plane rose, Elise whispered to herself, "We can't promise perfection, but we can promise we'll see you, and keep learning how." It came without warning. A Friday evening, quiet, nearly poetic in its calm. The office had thinned out, and most executives had gone home. Elise remained at her desk, sipping the last of her chamomile tea, reviewing final notes on Astrolux's quarterly ethics audit. Then the message arrived, encrypted, anonymous, sent to both her private inbox and the generic media desk. The subject line, "How much does Astrolux value reform?" Attached was a 78-page internal report, confidential, uncirculated. It detailed disciplinary recommendations, staff performance analytics, and private commentary from mid-level managers skeptical of the company's new diversity and accountability programs. Buried within the file were emails Elise had never seen, mocking references to the Monroe case, dismissive language about the reverse lens program, and proposed budget cuts to ethical retraining initiatives. Even worse, it included Elise's early memos from over a year ago, before the public scandal, before the reforms, when she was still unsure, still cautious, her language more corporate than courageous. Someone had been keeping receipts, and now they'd gone public. Within hours, the media exploded. Leaked memos undermine Astrolux's moral makeover. CEO Elise Langford, two-faced or transformed? Passengers ask, were we just a PR strategy all along? A morning editorial accused Elise of running a redemption theater paid for in passenger pain. The backlash wasn't just digital. Protesters appeared outside the headquarters. Civil rights groups demanded accountability. Old allies began to distance themselves. And then came the shareholders. An emergency board session was called. In the sleek marble-walled conference room on the 43rd floor, Elise sat at the head of the table, facing 12 board members, some old guard, some newly appointed reformers. One of them, Stanton Barlow, a powerful investor and longtime skeptic of Elise's leadership, leaned forward. "These memos, Elise, they show hesitation, doubt, even contradiction. At best, you look conflicted. At worst, complicit." Elise didn't blink. "Yes," she said, "I was hesitant. I was learning. That's what growth looks like when you're honest about it. You begin cautiously, you make mistakes, and then, if you're willing, you transform." Another board member, May Lin, who had voted in favor of the reform charter months ago, asked quietly, "But if this leak is real, And from someone inside, it means someone within our own house no longer believes in what we're doing, or never did. What does that say about our culture? Elise turned to the room. It says we still have blind spots. That reform isn't a banner, it's a daily decision. And if we want to fix this, we don't retreat, we double down. But the board didn't fully agree. A motion was raised to initiate a formal review of Elise's leadership. It passed. With a 7-5 vote, effective immediately, Elise Langford would step down for 30 days while an independent ethics committee investigated the internal failings, both the leak and the broader concerns raised in the documents. She wasn't fired, but she was grounded. That night, Elise sat alone in her apartment. The city lights outside were blurred by the condensation on her window. Rain tapped lightly against the glass. She replayed the last 14 months in her mind. The fall, the vow, the climb, the Monroe case, and now this fall again. But it wasn't despair that filled her. It was clarity. The next morning, she made a choice. Instead of silence, she would speak. Not to defend herself, but to own the full arc of her story. She released a personal statement, not drafted by PR, but written alone, in the stillness of that stormy evening. Leadership, real leadership, is not the absence of doubt. It is the presence of courage in the face of it. Yes, I made mistakes. I underestimated the resistance. I overestimated how quickly culture could shift. But I never lied about my belief in change. If this leak teaches us anything, it is this. Transformation is not a switch. It is a muscle. And ours just got tested. For now, I will step back, as asked. Not in retreat, but in respect. And I trust this community, this company, and our values to hold each other up, even if I'm not in the pilot seat. The statement divided public opinion. Some saw it as noble. Others called it damage control. But one voice pierced the noise. Estelle Monroe. She released a video from her home in Atlanta. We met Elise after she failed us. We looked her in the eye. We watched her rebuild a company in real time. If we cancel every leader for who they once were, we'll have no one left to applaud for who they become. What Elise started isn't perfect, but it's working, because she never pretended she was finished. That's the kind of courage I want to stand behind. And I still do. The video went viral, and then slowly other voices rose. Former passengers, flight attendants. Even Carson, the agent who had once humiliated the Monroes, released a statement supporting Elise. She didn't throw me away. She trained me to see. That matters. Meanwhile, inside Astrolux, Marina took temporary command. She wasn't Elise, but she shared the same mission. Her first act, to launch a full digital forensic review to track the source of the leak. What she found surprised everyone. The leak hadn't come from a low-level staffer or a reformer resistor. It came from someone who once believed in the reforms. A senior HR analyst named Grace Talbot, once a vocal advocate of internal change, was a key contributor to early policy drafts. But in the last 3 months, she had grown disillusioned. Not with Elise, but with what she saw as the company's slow, bureaucratic implementation of urgent values. In her confidential resignation letter, she wrote, "Reform requires urgency, but I watch committees dilute action, bury boldness in red tape. I leaked the memos not to destroy Astrolux, but to wake it up. I believed exposure might force faster change." Her act had cost Elise her position, but in Grace's mind, it was a necessary fire alarm. When Marina shared the findings with Elise, now on temporary leave, Elise simply nodded. She was right about one thing, Elise said. Urgency. We can't afford to become slow in our sincerity. With the truth known, the board reconvened early. The review was accelerated, and after 3 intense weeks of testimony, data review, and public hearings, the independent committee made its final recommendation. Elise Langford should be reinstated, not because she was flawless, but because she had built a company culture where even a whistleblower was taken seriously. She returned not as a savior, but as a servant of the mission she had helped ignite. And this time, she came back not just with a plan, but with a sharpened resolve. The reforms would not slow down, they would speed up. Because as Elise finally declared in her return speech, reform doesn't fail when mistakes are made. It fails when the mistake becomes the excuse to stop trying. In Astrolux, we are not done. The ballroom was grand. Crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, polished floors that reflected the sharp heels and purposeful strides of CEOs, senators, activists, journalists, and survivors. This wasn't just another corporate event. It was the Global Aviation Ethics Summit, a historic gathering following a year-long reckoning across the industry. And at its center was a woman once nearly erased by scandal. Now, Elise Langford was the keynote speaker, but this wasn't about image rehabilitation anymore. It was about revolution. The world had changed since that first incident with the Monroe family on Flight 227. Airlines had revised their codes of conduct. New federal oversight was being implemented. The Passenger Equality Act was now in Congress, driven in part by data supplied by Astrolux's transparency unit. Yet amid all that, some still wondered, was it real or just optics? Elise planned to answer that, not with promises, but with proof. As she stepped onto the stage, the room hushed. She wore a navy blue suit, simple, sharp, grounded, no teleprompter, no notes, just the truth. A little over a year ago, she began, I sat in a sterile office, watching a video of a family, Estelle, Jonah, and baby Isaiah, being treated like intruders in a space they paid for. I wish I could say I was shocked, but the truth, I had seen versions of it before. Maybe not on camera, maybe not in first class, but I had seen it in my silence, in the structures I upheld, in the stories we didn't tell. That day I made a vow, not a PR vow, a personal one. I would stop mistaking politeness for progress, that I would stop calling later a strategy, that I would use whatever power I had, not to protect the brand, but to change the industry. She paused. The silence was powerful. We didn't do everything right. We moved too slowly in places. We stumbled. We disagreed. We even leaked. But we also built something that held up through fire. We fired people, not for failing, but for refusing to change. We retrained 31,000 crew members, not just in compliance, but in compassion. We paid reparations, not because we were sued, but because we were sorry. And we promoted the very people once pushed aside, so they could sit at the tables where rules are written. Then she smiled. And tonight, I'm proud to announce something more. Something permanent. A screen behind her lit up. The Monroe Initiative, founded in partnership with Estelle and Jonah Monroe, a global fund seeded with $120 million dedicated to supporting victims of airline discrimination, funding independent watchdogs in travel equity, providing scholarships for underrepresented youth pursuing aviation careers. But that wasn't all. There's one more change, Elise said, and this one will fly. The screen changed again. Astrolux Flight 227, now permanently renumbered, Flight M1M, for Monroe. One, because justice begins with the first. The audience stood. Applause roared. Not polite, but raw. It wasn't just about Elise. It was about who she had become and who she had lifted with her. Backstage, Estelle Monroe embraced Elise, tears in her eyes. You did it, Estelle whispered. You didn't just fix the flight. You fixed the flight path. Jonah, holding baby Isaiah, now a little taller, more curious, smiled and added, let's just hope next time he flies first class it's boring. They all laughed, because they knew the fight wasn't over, but they also knew they'd shifted something permanent. 3 days later, President Linda Chavez signed the Passenger Equality Act into law. Reporters called it the Monroe Law. In its first clause, no seat, no class, no altitude shall determine dignity. And what of Elise? She declined an offer to extend her contract. 6 months after the summit, she quietly stepped down. Her final internal message read, Astrolux doesn't need a face. It needs a foundation. I was part of its rebuilding. Now it belongs to everyone. She left the headquarters with no cameras, no press, just a suitcase, a slim laptop, and a train ticket, because this time she wasn't flying. She wanted to feel the ground again. And the person who replaced her, Marina Ruiz, the woman who once cried behind a closed office door, thinking she'd failed the Monroes, Now she wore the badge of CEO, not because she was perfect, but because she had walked through fire and learned how to carry others through it. Epilogue. A little boy, 5 years old, steps into a cockpit on a school tour. He's the only black child in the class. The pilot kneels and says, "Have you ever flown a plane before?" The boy shakes his head. The pilot hands him a small silver pin, Flight M1 engraved across the wings. "Well, you just started." The boy grins. His name, Isaiah Monroe. And the sky, now fully his. Lessons learned from the story. 1. Dignity should never depend on a seat number. This story reminds us that respect is not a luxury reserved for the wealthy or the privileged. Every passenger, every person, regardless of race, age, status, or appearance, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. No uniform, rank, or policy should override that truth. 2. Real leadership means facing the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Elise Langford's transformation shows that leaders are not defined by perfection, but by their response to failure. By choosing honesty over image and action over excuses, she redefined what it means to lead with courage, integrity, and accountability. 3. Justice isn't a destination. It's a responsibility. What began as a moment of injustice became a movement because people didn't let it end with silence. From the Monroe family's courage to Astrolux's reforms, this story proves that systemic change starts when everyday people take a stand and when organizations choose to listen and evolve. 4. Apologies are not enough. Reform is the real apology. A sorrow can be forgotten, but policies, protections, and pathways built from those apologies last far longer. Astrolux's choice to implement tangible reforms, reparations, and the Monroe Initiative demonstrated that real healing requires real change. 5. Power, when shared, becomes transformation. By giving voices back to the silence, by lifting people from passengers to partners, Astrolux didn't just recover from a scandal. It helped rebuild trust, setting a new industry standard that proved what happens when corporations put people before profit.